Happy Tuesday, March 28th. We are closing out the third month of 2023. Welcome to another episode of Let's Start Justice. My name is Michael Jackson.
And I'm Jade Williams.
Now, I just want to say thank you so much to our listeners who are joining us via the Bridge 99 website, our YouTube channel for Jamaicans for Justice, and certainly those who are listening on the radio. We appreciate your company each Tuesday. And I must say that I think I keep saying this for the past couple of weeks that we're progressing nicely as a radio show, Jade. Our listeners are certainly growing.
Yes, I think we're making a bit of an impact.
Even those on Instagram who we tease, if they tune in for nothing else, I'm happy that they're responding to the credit trivia questions.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
we are happy for you joining us each week. Now, as usual, we're going to be starting the show by looking at some human rights issues of the week. And I want to turn your attention to an article that was in the Jamaica Gleaner. And the headline is Tax Threat. Government warns high-stakes bauxite shutdown risk $6 billion in new taxes. I couldn't help but laugh.
Mm-hmm.
And I laughed because it wasn't funny. Not at all. But I was in complete amazement. When you look at what is happening in several communities that are affected by bauxite mining down by St. Anne, for example, JFJ, we have been working with some of the residents ourselves, and we've gotten complaints, for example, of the dust nuisance basically choking people
To be frank,
into medical expenses.
anecdotally, just being there for one day irritated my latent asthma.
Yes, and the staff, I mean, you all were complaining
Yes,
when you came back.
The entire staff was
right?
affected.
People are facing threats because they dared to speak up. So the medical issues are affecting people in the bauxite mining areas. You're talking about loss of livelihoods. Our school children, for example, are being placed at risk. And our government has indicated to the appeal court, and I'm reading from the Jamaica Gleaner article, the government has told the appeal court that cutting welfare spending or imposing $6 billion in taxes are the main options facing Jamaicans if two bauxite companies are not allowed to mine parts of St. Anne and Trelawney. Absolute amazement. And I just want to put in context to the listeners that there is a current court case
Yes.
where an injunction was issued to the bauxite mining companies for them to cease their operations for now.
Yes.
I don't remember the special mining license that was under.
It was 173.
173.
Yes.
And this is the response from the government. And I want to read another part of the article because, again, I was in amazement. And it says, were bauxite and mining to be shut down, the government of Jamaica would be confronted with a gap in finance in the annual budget. A loss of bauxite levy would mean that cuts would need to be made to the expenditure budget for the government at a time when the government social assistance program has significant demands. This was in the affidavit dated October 25th from the lawyers representing the government of Jamaica. So in other words, the residents down by St. Anne and Trelawney, they should continue suffering. And our government has come out batting for private companies.
When I think about just the lack of access to water alone, even if we were not to talk about what may be health effects from the dust, we would have to talk about the water because there's no running water in a lot of these communities where persons are affected by the mining. And
that community itself done by St. Anne is a forgotten community.
Absolutely. And because of them having to store the water and the dust contamination of that water, they basically have no access.
And by the way, this is why Jamaicans for Justice, we do believe that the governance structure of the environment portfolio certainly needs revision. We call on the government to ensure that there is a standalone Ministry of Environment, and NEPA would get the type of independence that is needed to ensure that it looks out for the environmental interest. Because in some instances, there's no balancing of the economy when people's lives are at risk.
Absolutely.
Right? So I'm urging the government of Jamaica to rethink its stance. But it can't be that the residents should continue to suffer, or Jamaicans face a $6 billion tax imposition, or the cutting of social assistance and welfare programs. Government, wheel and come again. That's the only thing I can say. There are some other things that came out in the media, and I know that we're going to be discussing some of them. Yes. One of which is the 2022 U.S. Department's Human Rights Report. So that is the story of the day for us here. And of course, Mr. Everall's Warmington proposals. And I'm trying to be very careful in my utterances at this point, and I tend to be extremely careful when I know that my thoughts aren't necessarily one that would lend itself to be publicly shared. Mm-hmm. So I am being very careful with my utterances here. But what can only be described as attempts to gut the Integrity Commission, that is what Mr. Warmington is proposing, and that's something that we're going to be discussing later on in the show. Yes. But the last thing I wanted to point out, there was a story, Jade, that shook me personally. A 12-year-old girl was buggered by a 20-year-old.
Yes, just read that story shortly before we came into studio.
And I had the opportunity, and I did a quick Google, and several other articles were similar in nature. And yet our parliamentarians are so caught up with what gay men may or may not be doing in their private homes that they fail to protect yet again the nation's vulnerable children because of complete lack of political will in making the necessary amendments to the definition of rape.
Absolutely, and as you know, is something that Jamaicans for Justice and many of our partners in civil society have spoken against. And when we say that we need to redefine this, what we call sexual intercourse in the Sexual Offences Act in order to protect the most vulnerable from these kinds of offences, we're told we are supporting the gay community.
But I want to challenge the men because they are part of the same challenges that we're having. So men, if you're listening, you are not protected under law. You can't be raped based on the definition of rape in our legislation.
Absolutely.
So I want to challenge us to be less caught up and really rethink our position that are quite frankly homophobic and has no place in a liberal democracy, to the point and to the extent that you're denying yourself the protection to you and your boys and our girls who are facing such, what is the word? Frightening circumstances.
I can't even think of the word to describe something so horrific.
So I think we need to challenge some of our sociocultural norms in the country. But anyway, over to you, Jade.
Yes, I'm going to quickly do our Did You Know? And it is, I think, topical, considering Mr. Warmington's comments. But our Did You Know this week is on the Integrity Commission. And it states the function of the Integrity Commission is to combat corruption through development, implementation, and enforcement of anti-corruption legislation, policy, and initiatives. And we do have a trivia question for this week. Our trivia question is, name the chairperson and at least 2 other commissioners of the Integrity Commission. And you can respond to our trivia question via our social media pages, or you can WhatsApp 2397583 and you will win a credit from the network of your choice should you succeed.
All right, so just to go into today's topic, we're looking at the 2022 Country Report on Human Rights Practices in Jamaica, and that report was released by the U.S. State's Department. And the United States, through that report, and I want to clarify here that the U.S. report is based on reports from civil society as well as media reports and those from the state agencies. So I before I even start reading, I want to say that this is no imposition of the United States on Jamaica's sovereignty or issues. This is really a compilation, if you will, of challenges that we have faced as a country. But they have raised concerns regarding several aspects of human rights violations in the country, and they have called for stronger action from the government. And this was in relation to the human rights issues that arose in 2022. And it is noted that the government has taken some steps to address the issues, but there were still significant matters that really need some addressing by the government of Jamaica.
Yes, so the publication highlighted that significant human rights issues, including credible reports of unlawful and arbitrary killings by government security forces, cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment by government, harsh and life-threatening conditions in prisons and detention facilities, arbitrary arrest and detention, and governance corruption, as well as lack of investigation and accountability for gender-based violence, were some of the issues highlighted.
Now, you can imagine that several members of the government, including its state agencies, the Jamaica Constabulary Force, have responded. Mr. Dennis Brooks, who is the communication strategist within the JCF, he raised some concerns around how the data is presented in the report, noting that there are limitations, and he would have hoped that the JCF would have been consulted during the process of writing this report. And the Minister of Information, Robert Nesta Morgan, also spoke with the Jamaica Observer, and he noted that there were areas certainly that the government has taken pause around, and he sees the report as an important tool to really revisit our human rights practices in the country. And I think the response from Minister Morgan is a reasonable one. I don't get a sense, based on reading that article in the Jamaica Observer, that at no point he basically chastised the report or had anything negative to say. I think his position was quite reasonable, where he said, yes, there are some areas that were flagged that arguably so it really requires the government of Jamaica to take some review around. But I think as we have this discussion, we're going to be asking ourselves, what are some of the areas, Jay, that we need improvement on, and whether or not some pending laws that the government is currently reviewing, for example, the bail bill, the mandatory minimums, how will that exacerbate some of the situations that we have here that were flagged in the report. And we're going to be joined by Mr. Horace Levy. He's a human rights advocate and director with Stand Up for Jamaica, as well as Danielle Archer. She's an attorney at law and a director at National Integrity Action. We will be joined by them after the break. Welcome back to Let's Start Justice. We are discussing the 2022 Country Report for Human Rights Practices in Jamaica. We are joined by Horace Levy, human rights advocate, and Ms. Danielle Archer, attorney at law and director at National Integrity Action. Welcome to you both.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. All
right, great. I trust you both had an opportunity to read the U.S. State Department's report.
Yes. Certainly.
Okay, great. So, Mr. Levy, let me start with you. What was your immediate reaction when reading that report? What were some of the things that jumped out?
What jumped out was that it was rather sweeping. But when I looked more carefully, I realized that there are 7 sections to the report, and one shouldn't really judge everything from the first section. The other 6 actually on civil liberties, political process, corruption, government's attitude towards international investigations of human rights abuse, discrimination, societal abuse, worker rights. Those 6 have a lot of positive elements in it. I mean, there's little I could to criticize in the section on civil liberties and political process, for example. The section on corruption is rather meager in its content. It's very weak. It doesn't touch on the problems that the Integrity Commission have been facing with Parliament, for example, which are not just recent. They've been going on for some time. The 5 annual reports that the Parliament, that the Commission has submitted, have never had much response from the Parliamentary Committee, any response. And then the one on worker rights, though overall okay, has not dealt with the problem security guards have been facing, with being transferred from being contractors to employed, and the slow pace of the security firms in making that transition for them, and the problems they've had in getting there right. So there's some weaknesses, definitely, in those 6 chapters, but on the whole, they're fairly okay. They're fairly positive. The one that's rather sweepingly negative is the first one, which is titled respect for integrity of the person. Respect for the integrity of the person. And this one deals with killings, detentions, trials,
Yes.
that whole set. And that's where you've got a lot of sweeping statements, some of which in effect have been denied by the sections later on in civil liberties and political process. But there you are. That's there's a bit of an impression of the very negative impression from that first section. That was my first impression, yes.
All right, great. And I'm happy that Mr. Levy outlined that certainly there are certain civil rights and liberties that we have enjoyed quite well as a country for several decades now, if you will. For example, our political rights, it has certainly improved. We have low levels of political violence and those issues. So I think that is something worth lauding.
Freedom of expression, for example.
Absolutely. And one of the highest levels of respect of press freedom across the Caribbean.
And these are acknowledged in the report.
Absolutely. Ms. Archer, from your perspective, what jumped out at you?
I agree with Horace in many respects in terms of the annual report. I would add, though, that to my mind, it's very comprehensive as a report, going through the many dimensions of human rights in the 7 sections that Horace has identified. I agree with you that the report acknowledges, as we should, that Jamaica's continuing example and progress to have respect for civil liberties, particularly press freedom, as you've identified. And I thought it's important that they also recognize that the government generally respects judicial independence and impartiality. And this is something that we want to ensure that Jamaicans accept, understand, and work towards safeguarding and strengthening these positives.
And be guided by what is happening in Israel, for example.
Correct. And be alert to instances where, whether it is by change of law or implementation of legislation, that we are reducing the options available to us when we talk about being able to participate in the political process and to enjoy civil liberties. I think it was instructive, Michaela, in 2 areas, though. One, you will recall that there has been much talk about prison conditions.
Yes.
And they have identified that as being abusive. And that is a conversation that I do think we need to have, given the antiquity of the prison system that we have, as well as whether or not it's working in terms of reducing crime and violence. I think that is something on the table that you take from the report. I'll also add, there is a section in the report that is also a positive in many respects. They identified the detentions in St. Andrews, St. Catherine, Kingston, and St. James. And they indicated the challenge that we're having with the states of emergencies and detentions. But what is important is that they noted that persons were able to enjoy being able to be represented successfully, or effective legal representation, I believe is the term, and pointing out that they have been able to successfully challenge unlawful detention. And I think that is something to be mindful of in all the circumstances, that even in the space of the violations that they have identified or highlighted, they have also acknowledged that this is a positive, that this enjoyment exists where people are unlawfully detained.
Yes, and I think it certainly ties back into the point that you made, Daniel, earlier about the importance of retaining and maintaining our judicial independence, because when you have effective access to justice, it really means that some of those rights violations can get some remedy.
Correct. As you both talk about that, I know, Mr. Levy, that Stand Up works directly with inmates in advocating for their proper treatment in these lockups. And I wonder how you consider our current legislative landscape, because we are moving towards, for example, you heard Minister Chuck. Well, I hope you would have heard Minister Chuck speaking about increasing the mandatory minimum for murder in the Offences Against the Person Act, as well as pre-charge detention becoming a possibility under the new bail bill. And I wonder what you think about this legislative trend and how it might affect what you would have noticed in terms of the prison condition.
Yes, it's a very negative trend, really. I mean, I was rather shocked, in fact, that Minister Chuck should be promoting this, because he's been very strong on restorative justice. And if you're going to put in the mandatory minimums that he's talking about, there's not going to be much opportunity to for restorative justice at all. What's going to happen is that the number of people in the prison is going to increase, and that increase is going to be those who have committed the more serious crimes, so murder and perhaps more than one. And with the increase in that number, then those with minor, who are in there for minor delicts and offenses, are going to be exposed to these people, more of these people, for longer periods of time. And already we're having, 2 out of every 5 prisoners, 2 out of every 5 inside of prison come back. And that means that they're out there. They come back because they are committing the same crimes or similar ones again. So that the prison system is fostering the very criminality it's seeking to prevent. It doesn't make sense at all.
I mean,
if you really want to rehabilitate, which should be the one of the 2 main objectives of detention. There are 2 objectives. One is to restrain those who can harm the population. They have to be restrained. There's no question about that. Mm-hmm. And the other one is to rehabilitate them. The objective of the prison system is not to punish, but to restrain and to rehabilitate. And if you really want to rehabilitate, then you must seek to prevent those in there from returning. And the way to prevent them from returning is precisely to rehabilitate them, to give them every opportunity to go out and begin to live and to earn as normal people do without breaking the law. So,
well, what would you say to the argument that it is it might be more effective for these longer term detentions where the person would not re-enter society at all and therefore would not have the chance to reoffend?
Well, I think the solution lies in having 2 kinds of prison. One for those 200 to 300 really serious criminals, repeat rapists, and people who prey on young children and so on. A really high detention prison for them, with opportunities even in there for rehabilitation, but to keep them separate. And the rest of those who are in correctional institutions, into institutions like Tamarind Farm. So we already have on Spanish Town Road something that could be converted into a really high detention. It's approaching it already. Detention, a high security rather, type of prison for the first 200 or 300 I referred to. But we need more of the Tamarind Farm type, low security, but more opportunities to be recreated, to be reborn, to be rehabilitated, and so on, which is what the majority of those behind bars are capable of having happen to them.
I
so
that's
the solution, I think, is the 2 kinds of prison. Sorry.
Yes, sorry, Mr. Davey. I think Daniel wanted to just add something to that.
Yes, I wanted to come in there because I think besides having that discussion about the kinds of prisons that we need, we must recognize that we have at least 2 of our prisons which the report cited as being constructed, one in 1714 and the other in 1845, which have not received regular maintenance and create dangerous conditions in dilapidated buildings. So when we're having this conversation about maximum sentences and where we're going to house them, I do think a reasonable starting point is where are you going to house them? Because if you're going to keep that which you have and add to that which you have, you've got to have the space to do so. Mm-hmm. And that's a conversation without more that we need to look at, because as the report has highlighted, the allegations of abuse within the juvenile detention centers, bearing in mind the fact that you have limited toilet facilities, ventilation, and the health and the food conditions, the lack of medication. Those are things that were highlighted. So even if we're considering increasing the maximum sentence, one has to ask the question, what are the conditions? Because we do have our international obligations as to how we are to house and treat our prisoners.
All right. We're going to take the break. On the other side of the break, I want us to, I'm going to ask both of you just to stick with us for a few more minutes, and we can pick up in terms of several incidents that were highlighted where police fatal shootings were involved, and the response from the Minister of National Security. And I think the lack of response from the government and a strong condemnation, we believe, regarding police-involved shootings. So that is something I want us to pick up a discussion around, as well as some other matters that emerged last week. Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. I just want to remind those who are listening in that they can call the studio line at 676-4996.
Or you can WhatsApp us at 2397583, and you can message us on any of our socials or on our YouTube, which we are live on right now.
All right, perfect. We're discussing the 2022 Human Rights Report, and there's just a comment that I want to read from the report. And it states that comments in September by Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of National Security, Dr. Horace Chang, suggested that security forces should not hesitate to use lethal force, and that taxpayer-funded services, including ambulance services, should not be expended on suspected violent criminals. I think a number of us remember that situation. Unfortunately, Dr. Chang had not apologized. I think, with the greatest of respect to Dr. Chang, what he went on to do was to basically make reference to comments by supporters on social media that were making fun of human rights organizations, to say that we had expected the police force to act like Keanu Reeves in Matrix Revolution and that sort of commentary. And we found it most unfortunate, because from our estimation at JFJ, what was required was to say to the security forces that absolutely one must protect security of the person. But certainly, we believe without strong condemnation on what can be called extrajudicial killings in some instances, or perhaps not utilizing force as necessary, appropriate, and required, may lead to impunity. And that was JFJ's position. I'm not sure from your side, Daniel, if you had any comments around, not specifically this issue, but certainly generally any comment that would be required from the government regarding police-involved fatal shootings. Horace, to you?
No,
any response? No, Daniel fell off the call, so just shifting the question. Oh, you're back. Okay.
No, my reaction to Horace Chang's statement was that it's unacceptable. He was equivalently, by saying no ambulance and so on, saying kill them off. It was an invitation to just exercise force without any restraint whatsoever. At least that's the way I read it.
Yes.
And that's an invitation to extrajudicial killings. You know, in the context especially where our police have sections of our police, rather, not all of them by any means. Indicom has identified a dozen of them who are particular offenders. But certainly among that lot, there is a tendency to kill, to use the force without any restraint once there is an opportunity. So totally unacceptable. Parenthetically, by the way, in the last conversation about the prisons, I should have made clear that even though I'm talking about a high security prison, but I'm by no means approving of the increase in the mandatory sentences, mandatory minimums. Yes. I am not at all, and neither is Standard for Jamaica. Anyway, I don't mean to.
No, thank you for the clarification. Daniel, your feedback to the comments, if you want to get that specific, or just generally, perhaps a response that is required from the government when you look at the increased number of police-involved fatal shootings. 2021, it was 127. 2022, we had 134 persons who were killed by members of the security forces. It
certainly is undesirable. I'm sure you're going to be hearing on one end that you'd have to also look at the increase in crime and criminal activity and the number of gun crimes that we're having in terms of the numbers. Certainly you want to be able to have that kind of discourse and exchange from the government that speaks directly to it. I think that has been highlighted in the report and the recognition of the treatment of citizens when they are interfacing with the police is an issue that the report has highlighted. And I did hear at the onset your comments about the Minister of Information indicating that the report is a good starting point for the government to review or to examine their actions and to seek to improve. And so this is one area that you would want to see them address and indicate what steps to be taken to improve their relationship. NIA supports wholeheartedly the engagement of the public. You know, when you talk about recognizing the power of the police, engaging the public and ensuring that the use of force policies are in place and utilized as best as possible so that we are not faced with the continued situation of having these, as people would call it, the shootouts between the police and citizens.
Yes.
Recognizing that there is in fact a force policy that speaks to how force should be used. Seeing that, doing more education on the part of police and ensuring that even when they're faced, and I think that's the harsh reality that we have to look at, the reality that our police are facing dire consequences much more so than before. And they too, being individuals who have their lives on the line, are responding to situations which are life and death, and how they respond is under greater scrutiny in these circumstances. And so that balance has to be struck to ensure that they're doing so in a position and in a manner that is legally recognizable.
Absolutely.
May I add something?
Yes, before we segue into another area.
No, just on this. Daniel is right. The context is important. And clearly, in an immediate, in a particular situation where a police person has his or her life threatened by a criminal, then clearly self-defense is completely acceptable, and none of us would dispute that. I don't think.
Absolutely not.
And civil rights organizations are not against such a police person making a defense. But the fact of the increase in criminal activity can be looked at in two ways. Is it to be viewed as an occasion for increasing the fatalities, or is it to be taking a broad view, viewed as, in fact, an effect of increased repression of more and more fatalities that the police do? There is more and more response. One has to see it in those terms. In other words, that the repression that been foisted on the situation, far from alleviating it, is worsening it. Precisely by not resolving the problem at its roots, and therefore encouraging those who are inclined to criminal acts to go ahead because they won't get caught.
Yes.
So,
and outside of that furtherance of criminal behavior, one of the challenges, I know Jade and I, we have been discussing this internally, that when you have lack of updates from the security forces, the High Command and the Minister of National Security, in some instances where on social media we may have seen videos of the police, for example, being caught up in verbal spars with individuals. I recall Teron Hewitt,
yes,
24-year-old, I believe, who was shot. He was unharmed, shot in the back by a soldier, and absolutely no update to date.
yes.
Well,
And we believe that is unacceptable, because what it does is to further place citizens and security forces in that situation of lack of trust, if you will. And I think that perhaps would have led to the increased altercations when you look at some of these communities that are currently under SOE and ZOZO.
And
Yes,
I
great.
just
So-
quickly say,
you're onto
Mikkel,
something with a good point, because the report did highlight that there were reports of such situations where nothing was done. There were no investigations. And that they have alluded to really does contribute to how citizens respond and the expectations that they have in those circumstances. So you are reflecting the mode of the report.
well,
The lack of
yes,
accountability and the lack of handling of the situation, so that the public feels confident that where there's a breach of the procedures and there has been overzealousness on the part of the officers, that there is the consummate or reaction in terms of accountability or punishment, so to speak.
Well, I can say that just anecdotally, JFJ's intervention team would have heard similar sentiments coming from citizens, even those in Teron Hewitt's community,
Right.
that would have said, prior to this incident, while we always had issues with the police, the JDF we supported, and now that this incident has taken place and we can see no redress, we no longer have that confidence in the JDF.
Especially when there are multiple incidents within the same vicinity, if you will.
Yes.
But to shift focus a little bit, I know Jade has some pressing questions around this particular matter. The matter of corruption was raised in the report.
Right.
And similarly, it suggests that public officials may be involved in corruption or corruption-related matters with impunity. And then when we look at Mr. Everett Warmington's proposals within the Joint Select Committee, I can't really fathom why the proposal was even necessary, with the greatest of respect to the Joint Select Committee. But he had called for the removal of prosecutorial powers from the Integrity Commission, called for impeachment of the Integrity Commissioners and its executive director by members of Parliament. He called for the parliamentary privilege that is afforded to the Integrity Commission to be removed, where the Integrity Commissioners, I don't know who would remain in that position, if they could be sued for defamation. What else did he call for? He called for them to have their statutory filings.
Yes, to be gazetted.
To be gazetted.
Yes.
And I want to remind the listeners that only the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition is subjected to such requirement.
Yes.
So, Jade, you had some questions for Daniel and Horace.
Well, in the context of one of the findings from the Human Rights Report was around the ability of the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions to pursue certain prosecutions just due to capacity. And I wonder, with Warmington's suggestion that the DPP be given this prosecutorial power from the Integrity Commission, how would that possibly
to such situation?
Yeah, how would that possibly be sustainable, considering the issues that the DPP office already has in terms of its capacity now? And I pose that to either of you, so either of you can respond.
We can start with you, Daniel, and then Horace.
All right, so let's take it as a whole then, listeners. If you are looking at a situation where you have constantly heard that Jamaica doesn't pay, they give lip service to corruption. So we institute the law, but we don't enforce it. You have to recognize that we've had the Integrity Commission, and they perhaps, in literal terms, shot themselves in the foot the other day with what transpired, and gave an opening for the politicians to coalesce and say, this is why we don't want them. Taking it from that perspective, I don't just want to look at what the suggestions are made by Minister Warmington. I want us to look at the importance of having the Integrity Commission, because what he has suggested by way of his amendment would, without any contradiction, weaken the strength of this anti-corruption body.
Yes.
So
Daniel, can you pause that thought for me? And I hope you can really stay with us for a few more minutes. The producer is saying we need to take a break.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We are joined by Mr. Horace Levy and Miss Danielle Archer. Daniel, right before the break, you were telling us why the Integrity Commission is important, and I want you to continue to educate our listeners on that.
We are talking about an entity that has been globally recognized. I must remind you that when Jamaica jumped in the Transparency International CPI Index, the rankings in 2017, it was the very same year that Parliament passed the long-awaited anti-corruption law, the Integrity Commission Act. Yes. That act merged the country's three leading anti-corruption commissions into a single agency. Now imagine that you would have the very same legislation that we're asking to be watered down now. That was the very same legislation that allowed us to jump in the rankings to where we have stayed for the last 10 years. That very act, when you think about all the things that are in it, was there for a purpose. So you've mentioned the prosecutorial powers. That is there because it recognized that the DPP's office did not have the strength of resources to do so, and you also wanted to have a body that's dedicated towards corruption. The amendment that speaks about the gazetting of statutory declarations, one must ask yourself, Do public officials at this particular moment, are their statutory declarations gazetted? Is the statutory declaration of the leader of opposition and the prime minister gazetted? Or is it a summary? And if we're asking for that, we're going to have to say, well, but there doesn't seem to be any legitimate basis. You want to get back at the commissioners because you think that their actions are of such that they're against all politicians. And so they coalesce to say, let's get back at them, let's weaken them, because if we weaken them, then we get to expose them. That's not what you want. What you want is to strengthen in the wake of what has transpired the Integrity Commission to ensure that you actually do put action to purpose, which is enforcing the legislation against anti-corruption. Permanent secretaries, directors of public bodies, I don't think any MPs are required to have their statutory declarations gazetted.
No.
If it is, am I incorrect?
No.
You're correct.
You're quite correct.
So if it is that we're saying that the commissioners should have their statutory declarations gazetted, let's be fair. Let's do it right across the board.
Absolutely.
You're talking about the provision of impeachment. I'm excited to hear about that because you know what? This is something that we have been talking about for eons in respect of politicians. So if we're going to be doing it in respect of the IC, then let's have a wide open table where we actually do implement impeachment for MPs.
And entrench it in the Constitution as long promised from the 1990s.
They are no different from the commissioners. And I think what we need to understand is, yes, there was a boo-ha-ha, something that ought not to have happened, a strict or a conservative interpretation of the legislation. However, we have had an entity that has sought and is established to fight corruption. We should be united in our efforts to ensure that this agency is only strengthened, not weakened, because we accept that corruption is a problem in Jamaica. And that should be something that they're unified around, which is why I tell you, look at it as a context. Because if we weaken and we take the amendments as they are, we are going to have a difficulty in saying that we have a robust enforcement capacity to fight corruption. And certainly it would affect how we are viewed internationally, because then we are going to be looking at having a legislation where parliamentarians can remove the commissioner. Is that really reasonable in circumstances where these are the persons who are going to be investigating our politicians? And they're now going to be at the liberty of the politicians? Look closely at legislation. Legislation ensures that they are protected and secured, so that there is no element of political interference.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Horace, and any feedback?
No, I mean, Daniel is right on target. Just to add that one of the things that Washington wants is to remove the disclosure, the transparency. And that's something that we've all been clamoring to keep and to expand. In other words, to remove the gag clause which presently exists. I mean, bear in mind that the Integrity Commission has been making recommendations year after year. They have not been implemented. They have not been dealt with by the Parliamentary Committee. And then Wilmington comes along and makes the blunder, as the Gleaner editorial today points out, of claiming that the Integrity Commission is the creature of Parliament.
But I don't understand his reasoning, though, Horace, around the separation of powers. Because I don't understand the reasoning either about separation of powers. Because in my mind, there is no one branch encroaching on the other in terms of the judiciary, the executive, and or the legislator. So I don't understand his reasoning or thought process, or whether or not technically it even makes sense, with the greatest of respect.
Well, to try and find reasoning in Wilmington statements is to look for a completely lost pearl. It's not there.
But you said something, Horace, and it's something that JFJ has been asking. And Daniel, you can correct me here. There is the Oversight Committee, that is a bipartisan one at the House of Representatives. And I recall the 2021 report, and we have been making reference to that report, citing it. And that report is by the Integrity Commission to indicate that the Oversight Committee that exists to provide parliamentary oversight of the Integrity Commission met only twice in the latter part of 2021. And to the best of my knowledge, they met not much more in frequency in 2022. And again, they haven't acted on any other recommendations of the Integrity Commission. So I think the Edmund Bartlett-led Oversight Committee has quite frankly failed in its oversight requirements of the Integrity Commission. And I think if you have failed, I really do call into question those press releases by the Senate, the public commentary by public officials. And I ask the Oversight Committee, why have you not yet sent a letter to the Integrity Commission? That is my immediate. I don't know, Horace, where you stand on any of what we have just disclosed, or if you have a difference of opinion there.
No, I don't have any difference of opinion. I think that the parliamentary committee has been seriously delinquent, and Wilmington's proposals are just outrageous and absurd, and should not be given any real attention at all. So I think we have to proceed to try and strengthen the Integrity Commission. Yes, it failed in one respect, in dealing with the prime ministerial charges and so on. But that's not a reason for stripping it of its powers or turning it over to Parliament. That's to reverse the process.
Yes. Last comment from you, Daniel. I want to ask you, what do you make of the call, at the very least, for the Executive Director of the Integrity Commission to resign?
In light of the circumstances, and I believe we have said before that if you look at what his job description is, the question would be, before you come to that conclusion, did he contravene any of the indications for his job description?
He made a retweet.
Right, and in those made a retweet, but in the context of his job description, which is what I'm saying, Michaela, is it that he breached those? And can we look at how it is that he can be removed based on what the legislation says? And this is where your opinion comes in terms of the oversight. Oversight doesn't mean a clear and strict focus on the issue of the gag clause, which has had the attention of everyone. And as you appreciate, NIA has consistently said we need to revisit that and have guidelines for how information can be shared. Oversight means looking at the very elements that allow the Integrity Commission to function and how you can improve them. And one such position now would be to look and see whether or not the actions of the Executive Director was of such that it contravened his contractual obligations and the expectations that he would have had under the Integrity Commission. The issue of resigning is a question for him, whether or not he thought his actions, particularly that of retweeting, was something that added fire to fury, as they say, or oil to the fire. Whether
fuel to the fire, yes.
Fuel to the fire, whether it is something to be done, and whether it is something that he thinks has affected the reputation of the Integrity Commission. Because you'll appreciate, to resign is to ask yourself, have I done that which I should have done, and have I affected the institution? And perhaps you're onto something when you say, should he resign? Because the question would be, with all of this focus, there has not been any response from the Integrity Commission to the public on the issue. And
outside of that initial press statement that they had made.
And
yes.
NIA has consistently called for that dialogue, an explanation from them, something that speaks to them. Don't say we don't talk to the media and we're only obliged to issue this press release. To invest trust and to encourage trust, you need to communicate. And that is why we've articulated and we've begged for and we've put the submissions for getting rid of the gag clause, because we believe that speaking and sharing information is important. And so the IC itself, even on the matter of a resignation of anyone, for the issue that occurred, there has to be some responsibility, because this is where we talk about accountability. Yes. And as far as NIA is concerned, we don't take that position that he should resign, but we do take the position that the Integrity Commission should have a conversation with the public.
Yes.
And if it is that they decide amongst themselves that their actions in any shape has caused one to lose confidence in the IC, then someone should take responsibility so that we can move on to strengthening the Integrity Commission rather than weakening it.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Yes, we have to,
thank you so much to Horace Levy, yes. Human rights advocate, Daniel Archer, attorney at law representing the National Integrity Action.
Yes.
Jade, over to you.
Yeah, we did have 3 winners to our trivia. You will be contacted by our communications officer.
We don't have a timestamp to who?
Apparently they were simultaneous, but I'm sure.
I'm sure a second apart is there. We don't have credit for give women.
Investigation investigations will be done. It's a good thing I didn't announce the names on air. We did have a very fruitful discussion. I feel like we didn't even get to ventilate as many
Boy, I
points as
think
we
Bridge
wanted
needs
to.
to give us another
2-hour
10 minutes
slot.
because I have some more points, but we have to leave it there, yes?
Yes. So thank you so much for joining us. This is Let's Talk Justice. We'll be back next week at the same time, Tuesday 1 p.m. I'm Jade Williams.
I'm Michael Jackson. Have a good Tuesday.